He's talking to us. So here it is, our show with the one and only Dr. Jeff Meldrum. I've been really looking forward to this.
Likewise.
Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, my pleasure.
You're on your way up from Idaho to BC.
That's right.
What are you doing up in BC?
There's a conference that's organized by a local enthusiast investigator, and these have sprung up like mushrooms. They're great opportunities. Many people don't realize how much evidence there really is.
Right.
That is really quite compelling. I mean,
evidence.
It's not conclusive. The norms, the traditions of zoological discovery require a specimen, a physical specimen, and eventually the establishment of a type. But short of that,
Meldrum.
There's no reason we should just sit on our hands and wait for a specimen to be dropped in our lap as curious it's scientists who the science starts when you have a question.
It's a doctor,
and this is one of the most intriguing questions I've encountered.
He probably just
so you're going up to give a presentation to a group of folks that are also enthusiastic. What's interesting about you, and not a qualification that a lot of other people have who are like publicly about, Sasquatch and Bigfoot and cryptozoology in general, is that you're a bona fide anthropologist.
Right.
Your area of study dovetails in this interest in a way that I feel like gives particular credence to your thoughts, and not only that, but how you approach exploring those thoughts. Because being a professor and being an anthropologist and being an academic, there are certain things that you are tied to on principle that maybe a lot of other folks can kind of foist off to the wayside. So let me ask you two questions. Bigfoot or Sasquatch? And we'll talk relic hominid after that. But sure. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and what was the thing that started steering you this way? Was it an extension of your academic interest, or was it an event?
Right. Well, Bigfoot is a term that became attached to this phenomenon, and there's different sort of legendary accounts of the origin of that. The most common was that when Jerry Crew, a member of the construction outfit working at Bluff Creek in Northern California back in the 50s, made what seems to be the first plaster cast of a footprint, to preserve a footprint, in the United States at least, brought that into town. The local editor of the newspaper, Andrew Gonzoli, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, took a look and reportedly said, "Wow, that's a big foot."
You're like, "Yes, it is."
But I foot.
You're like, "Yes, it is."
But I started using the term Sasquatch more preferentially because, in part, out of deference, as it originated out of deference to the tribal traditions, the First Nation traditions of Canada. This term was coined by J.W. Burns, who was an educator on one of the reserves there in British Columbia. And he was also a writer, aspiring writer, and wrote articles about these giant hairy people, the Sasquatch, which is kind of an anglicized version of a number of Native American names, which have some common denominators. I mean, each tribe in their own language has their own term. So Sasquatch roughly means the wild person of the woods, wild man of the woods. So it's a little bit more descriptive in that sense. It's a little more universal, a little more general of that character. that, you know, we actually find representation in literary sources all the way back to some of the earliest Western traditions, and you can find similar representations of hairy wild men even in many Eastern cultures. The Chinese Yeren, the wild man, literally translated, is remarkably similar in its description to the Sasquatch and leaves footprints that are virtually indistinguishable. So I've used Sasquatch. Even Sasquatch has become a bit commercialized, tabloid-ish, because of the popularity of the subject as a part of pop culture. And so that led to the the readoption, the resurrection, really, of the term relict hominoid, which was first coined by a Russian scientist, Boris Porzhnev, who was a cultural anthropologist, very interested in these stories of wild men in his country. And he, the term relict with a T, is the preferred form of the word used in biology to make reference to a population of a species that was once much more widespread, much more common, but has now become very restricted and, may be even on the verge of extinction.
Okay, so Bigfoot is what you see on a bumper sticker. Sasquatch is what you have in casual, intelligent conversation. If you're a researcher, you call him a relict hominoid. And if you slip up and call him a relic hominoid, people will be happy that you tried.
I mean, you make the effort, yeah.
And then the following thing I want to ask you is that where those footprints were first cast, that construction site, the Bush construction site, is that what it was?
Bluff Creek.
Yeah, the Bluff Creek construction site. That was kind of like the inciting event for Sasquatch and popular culture in North America. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that it's fair to say, because as a result of the publicity of that event and that photograph of this guy holding this 16, 17-inch plaster cast, it was on the front pages of papers all across the country. And, the public awareness of what had been transpiring actually for decades. I mean, there were stories. I mean, you can go back even to the historical newspaper accounts and so forth in the eastern states even. And they don't have the word Bigfoot, but if you search for things like wild man or gorilla, these types of
great ape of the north or something like that.
Right.
It's just
or of the Appalachian. Yeah.
This condensed
booger. It. Well, it was some physical evidence. You had more than just a story. Something made this footprint. Now, then it became controversial. Were they hoaxed? Was it just a prank? And there were some that volunteered, responsibility for that, unjustifiably, in my opinion. But and others that thought, there was something to this. Even when the footprints were first being discovered, it wasn't clear what was leaving them, if they were even authentic. If they were authentic, there were theories like, well, it's again a wild tribe of giant Indians that have escaped detection, or it was an escaped lunatic from an insane asylum. I mean, literally, that was expressed. Or it was a mutated bear that walked upright. It had funny looking feet, and then it was, there was actually a couple guys that were out there hunting for whatever this was. And they reportedly were driving back to camp. And as they rounded the corner, their headlights caught this big figure hunkered to the side of the road that stood up to its full height, and in 2 steps was across the road into the trees on the other side. And they described it as a giant hairy ape. There are some who argue that if you go back to J.W. Burns' original descriptions of the Sasquatch, you might think that he was describing a race of people, humans with just long shaggy hair on their head. But the notion of an ape-like thing, they say, was contrived later, that kind of to create a narrative. I don't think that's justifiable, because you look at some of the earliest accounts, and you got to remember, way before the internet, way before cable television. So the ability of these ideas to disseminate through the population was just limited to the occasional newspaper account and whatever. But whether even communication between newspaper outlets and things back in those days. So very early on, there was a report. I mean, one of the most classic stories is the account by William Rowe, and it's a very straightforward account. It's in its simplicity. It's very persuasive, because he was an amateur prospector, was out looking for kind of the lost gold mines and so forth.
That's a nice story.
Up there in British Columbia, and he describes hearing this sound. He was taking advantage of some of the berries, and he noticed over here's this figure. You could see it from the back, and this big, broad shoulders and head, and covered with hair. And he said eventually it turned, and he could see the face, and it would pull just the details he described. It would bring the branch up rather than picking the berries off with fingers. Yeah, it would just picking them off, and he described the very dexterous lips, the muscular lips, and the drawing that you get is this tall, husky, robust, long-legged creature with more human-like feet, and sporting a pair of breasts, human-like breasts, which was different. But the rest, the way the head was drawn, beetle brow, low forehead, sloping skull, and sort of a deep set jaws, not particularly prognathic, but a little flat nose across on a big upper lip. And I mean, it's as ape-ish as you can imagine. You look at that and you can't help think, but something, I mean, if not ape, then something like some primitive caveman, some primitive human ancestor or relative. But the Bigfoot encounter, the footprints discovered in Bluff Creek in 1958, that really emblazoned it in the U.S. Psyche. And from there, it just kind of snowballed in a way. I mean, but it's not like it started there. I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah, but I mean, like there are all these. Well, I'll give you. Are you a music person at all?
A little bit, yeah.
Well, you know Bob Dylan.
Oh yeah.
Okay, well, it's like Bob Dylan didn't invent folk music, right? But like he's like a touchstone, and before that, you have Woody Guthrie, right? So like Woody Guthrie didn't invent folk music either, but like so there are these
Oh sure.
So but in this metaphor, I'm gonna bring it back to this later.
Yeah.
The Bluff Creek was Woody Guthrie. Something that happened a few years later is Bob Dylan. Yeah. And we'll talk about that. But first, I want to know how you particularly.
Well, I don't want to steal your thunder, because my touchstone was, I think, what you're leading up
to.
The Patterson Gimlin film. So I was a youngster, 10 years old, in 6th grade in Spokane, Washington. And in 1969, which the film was shot in October of 67.
Try to make podcasts.
By early 69, this was March 1st.
Tell immediately.
At one of the first public showings of the film to a public venue. It had been already examined by a panel of scientists at the University of British Columbia, and then it was taken out to the Smithsonian, and a panel of scientists viewed it there. So I'm at school, and the kids, it was actually an evening program for the parents, and we're sitting in our classroom, by ourselves, waiting for our cue to go in and perform. And the kids were all abuzz because there had been this newspaper advertisement for this upcoming showing on the next Saturday. And so this just captured my imagination. I mean, I'd never heard of Bigfoot previously. And in any case, I ran home that night and got the paper out, and sure enough, there's the advert. Convinced my dad we had to go see this. And so he and I and my younger brother went to the Spokane Coliseum, sitting on the third row. Roger comes out onto the stage and introduces himself and his documentary that showcased that 60 seconds of film footage, which we saw over and over and over on a giant screen, in the auditorium there, much larger than life. And wow, what an impression that made. And so, those continue to, all those things continue to play a very significant and important role. In fact, when I'm up here at BC, my lecture is a 55-year later retrospective of the Patterson-Gimlin film, because, not only the things that we have learned through improved technologies that allow us to examine the film, and unfortunately the original is no longer in existence, or
Right.
But we have one of the projects I was involved with was the production of a composite, a very precise composite stacking of the multiple copies that are out circulating of multiple generations to allow us to sort of amplify the signal and dilute the artifacts and idiosyncrasies of individual copies of film, not of digital. So that each copy has its own little quirky bits.
But you're making a composite of something that has a lot of
And so, I mean, the composite doesn't provide any aha moments, any aha revelations. But what it does is things are sharper, clearer, and the researcher, the doctorate, he was a doctoral student at the time of the project, and now has a PhD in computer vision. But he also did a very precise stabilization of the film. So, I mean, it's motionless.
smooth.
And so that allows us to play it for an audience and point out features now that are much more evident than when you're trying to focus on this, bouncing ball going across, or a bouncing figure. But in addition to those analyses, the advantage now we have of a 55-year retrospective is we can see how it was received against the paradigm in 1967 and the contextual understanding, and what has changed in 55 years.
Yeah.
And it's stunning, because in 1967, the prevailing idea about the pattern of human evolution was this single file march. Anthropology was influenced by ecology, central to which was the niche hypothesis. That is, one species per one niche. Each species has its address defined by parameters that exclude others, because through competition they would be displaced.
This thing is filling this gap.
Exactly.
Because that no other things exist.
Exactly. Hails back to a Russian microbiologist who coined what was called the competitive exclusion principle, that no two species can occupy the same niche. So anthropology thought, well, hominin, going back to the term hominin, the hominin niche, big brains, bipedalism, and above all, material culture. And that makes it an exclusive club. There can be only one representative, and
That's it, yeah.
So when they look at the film, they're already predisposed. It can't exist. So how are we going to explain why it can't exist?
But now that time has divorced us from those.
Now we see the evolutionary tree as this bush with multiple species coexisting at any time in the past, and many of those branches having persisted until the present, until the recent, if not the present.
Yeah.
And so now there are hooks to hang these. And then this is one of the reasons, too, for the motivation behind coining a new term, relic hominoid, is because not all the wild men reported around the globe are Sasquatch. There are Sasquatch-like entities, species through Asia, and that's almost certainly the source of the North American Sasquatch. But in Russia, for example, there are what, in my opinion, can only be described as relic Neanderthals. Southeast Asia, we have the Hobbit, Homo floresiensis, which is almost certainly a relic Australopithecine. In the Himalayas, we have the Yeti. Its footprints look like a chunky chimpanzee with a divergent big toe. So